Give someone a week for a 1-hour task. It will take the whole week, every time. That's not laziness. It's not incompetence either. It's a documented pattern with a name, Parkinson's law. Work expands to fill the time available for its completion. Cyril Northcote Parkinson wrote that sentence in 1955, and it has been quietly running your calendar ever since. Here's the part that should bother you as a manager. The task itself does not determine how long it takes. The deadline does. Hand someone a report and give them a month, and they will fill that month. Second guessing, reformatting slides, nobody will remember. Meetings scheduled to discuss the meeting that's coming. Give the exact same report a 3-day deadline, and it still gets done. Same quality, a fraction of the time. Nothing about the actual work changed, only the container changed. So let's go deeper than the observation. Let's talk about why this happens, where it came from, and what it actually costs you when you don't account for it. Start with the mechanism. Why does empty time get filled instead of just sitting there unused? The honest answer is that humans are threat-averse by default, and open-ended time reads as a low-grade threat. When there's no hard constraint, your brain doesn't relax. It goes looking for risk to manage. Is this good enough? What if someone asks a question I can't answer? What if there's a version of this that looks more thorough? Without a deadline forcing a stopping point, there is no natural signal that says, "This is done." So people manufacture one. They keep polishing until the discomfort of stopping outweighs the discomfort of continuing. That's not diligence. That's anxiety, wearing diligence, as a costume. Perfectionism plays a role too, but it's not the vanity kind people assume. Most of it is defensive. Adding one more caveat, one more slide, one more round of review is a way of pre-covering for criticism that hasn't happened yet. It feels like responsible work. Functionally, it's stalling dressed up as rigor. And a generous deadline is exactly the fuel that stalling needs, because it removes the one thing that would normally interrupt it, running out of time. There's a third piece, and it's the one most managers miss entirely. A tight deadline doesn't just create urgency. It creates forced prioritization. When you only have 3 days, you cannot do everything you'd theoretically like to do. You are forced to rank tasks by actual value and cut the bottom of the list. That ranking is the valuable part. It's the part that a generous deadline lets you skip. With a month, you don't have to decide what matters, because you can technically do all of it, badly, a little bit at a time, without ever confronting the question of what's actually load-bearing. The tight deadline isn't just faster. It's a forcing function for judgment you'd otherwise avoid using. Put those three together, anxiety without a stopping signal, defensive perfectionism, and the absence of forced prioritization, and you get the exact behavior Parkinson described. Work doesn't expand because people are lazy. It expands because unstructured time removes every mechanism that would normally tell people when to stop and what to skip. There's a fourth factor worth naming, because it's the one that makes this so hard to see from inside your own team: social proof. When a task has a generous deadline, the people around the person doing it also behave as if the task is generously sized. Colleagues schedule check-ins on it. Someone asks for a status update in week 2, purely because the calendar suggests week 2 is a reasonable checkpoint, not because anything actually needs checking. Each of those touchpoints generates its own small follow-up task: a summary slide, a clarifying email, a revised timeline. None of it was necessary. All of it looks necessary once it exists, because now there's a paper trail implying the work was substantial. The deadline doesn't just shape the individual's behavior, it shapes everyone orbiting that individual, and their combined activity becomes the evidence that the long timeline was justified in the first place. It's a self-fulfilling loop. The long deadline creates the appearance of a big task, and the appearance gets cited as proof the deadline was appropriate. Now, here's where it actually came from, because the origin story is sharper than the one-line summary that gets repeated everywhere. Parkinson wasn't a management consultant. He was a British naval historian, and he wrote the essay for a British magazine in 1955, based on his own observation of the British Civil Service specifically, of the Admiralty and the Colonial Office. Here's the detail that makes it land. The British Empire was shrinking through the 1930s and into the post-war years. Colonies were being administered less, then not at all. naval bases were closing. The actual volume of work, ships to manage, territories to oversee was going down year over year in a fairly measurable way. And the bureaucracy managing all of it kept growing anyway. Parkinson pulled the numbers. Between certain years he studied, the number of Admiralty officials rose by a steady percentage annually, while the number of actual ships the Navy operated fell sharply over the same stretch. Fewer ships, more people managing the ships that were left. He found the same shape in the colonial office staff increased year after year, right through the period when Britain's colonial holdings were being handed back or given up. Nobody in that bureaucracy was sitting idle, either. That's the detail that makes the essay more than a joke about government waste. Everyone stayed just as busy as before. Meetings still ran long. Memos still circulated. Reports still got written and reviewed and revised. Busyness didn't track workload at all. It tracked headcount and available time. Give people more colleagues and more hours in the day, and they will generate enough activity to occupy both, regardless of whether the underlying work justifies it. Parkinson wrote about this with a dry, satirical wit. He wasn't just reporting a statistic, he was describing a system that had, in effect, started managing itself for its own sake. A memo would circulate for comment. Comments would arrive, disagreeing slightly with each other. A meeting would be called to reconcile the disagreement. Minutes from that meeting would circulate for further comment. At no point did anyone individually behave unreasonably. Each step looked like ordinary diligence from the inside. It was only from a distance, looking at the shrinking empire and the growing ministry side by side, that the absurdity became visible. Parkinson's explanation for the growth itself was almost mechanical. An official who feels overworked has three options: quit, share the work with an existing peer, or hire two subordinates below them. Quitting risks status. Sharing with a peer creates a rival with equal footing. Hiring two subordinates creates a manager out of the original official, with nobody positioned to compete for their job, so officials reliably chose the third option. Then those two subordinates, feeling equally busy, did the same thing underneath them. The organization didn't grow because the work grew. It grew because growth was the path of least resistance for everyone inside it. And once headcount grew, work expanded to make all of it look necessary. That's the mechanism behind the mechanism. Time and headcount don't get left idle. They get filled, retroactively justified, and then defended as essential. It applies just as cleanly inside a 15-person startup as it did inside a colonial ministry losing its colonies. Let's make it concrete, because this is where it should change how you actually run things. These are illustrative scenarios, not real case studies, but the shape will be familiar. Take a hiring process. A role opens up. The honest amount of work required to fill it well, write the job description, screen resumes, run 3 or 4 structured interviews, check references, make a decision, is maybe 2 focused weeks of actual effort, spread across a small panel. But nobody puts a hard clock on hiring because "we want to get this right" feels like a reasonable, open-ended justification. So the process stretches. A 5th interview round gets added because someone wasn't fully convinced after the 4th. Feedback sessions get rescheduled because a calendar didn't align, and nobody treats that as urgent because there's no deadline creating urgency. A candidate who was strong in week 2 gets compared against candidates from week 6, months apart, based on notes nobody trusts anymore. 3 months pass. The role finally gets filled. And the person who accepts is, more often than not, someone very similar to who you would have hired in week 3 if you'd made yourself decide in week 3. The extra 10 weeks didn't produce a better hire. They produced more meetings about the hire. Take budget approval. A department needs sign-off on next quarter's spending plan. The actual analytical work reviewing line items, checking them against last quarter's actuals, flagging anything that looks off, getting 1 round of pushback and revision is realistically a few days of concentrated attention from the right 2 or 3 people. But budget season gets a quarter on the calendar because that's the rhythm the organization has always used. So it takes a quarter. Draft 1 circulates and sits, unread, for a week and a half because nobody's under pressure yet. Draft 2 adds detail nobody asked for because the extra time invites elaboration. A steering committee gets added, not because the numbers demand more scrutiny, but because a full quarter makes a steering committee feel proportionate. By the final week, the same 3 or 4 people who could have signed off in Draft 1 are approving Draft 5, with numbers barely different from where they started. The quarter didn't produce a better budget. It produced a budget that took a quarter, because a quarter is what it was given. Take a software bug fix. Something breaks in production. It's contained annoying, but not catastrophic, and it's assigned into the next 2-week sprint instead of treated as urgent. Watch what happens to a contained bug once it's inside a 2-week container instead of a same-day one. The engineer picks it up on day 1, reads the stack trace, and has a reasonable hypothesis about the cause within the first hour. But the fix isn't due for 2 weeks, so instead of writing the patch, they write a ticket exploring 3 possible root causes to be thorough. A design discussion gets scheduled for day 4 because 2 weeks is enough time to have design discussions about things that don't need them. Testing gets its own multi-day allocation, not because the fix is complex, but because the sprint has room for it to be complex. The fix that ships on day 13 is, in most cases, close to the exact fix that could have shipped on day 1, once the actual root cause is found. The other 12 days weren't spent making the fix better. They were spent making a small fix look appropriately sized for the container it was given. Take a strategy off-site. Leadership blocks 3 full days, off-site, to set direction for the next year. The actual decisions that come out of it, which 2 priorities to bet on, which one to explicitly deprioritize, who owns what usually takes something like 2 hours of genuinely hard conversation to nail down, once people stop circling and just decide. But 3 days were booked, so 3 days get used. Day 1 is framing exercises and a review of where things stand, most of which everyone in the room already knew coming in. Day 2 is breakout groups generating options, many of which quietly repeat ideas that were already raised in day 1, dressed in new language. The real decision, the one that could have taken 2 hours, finally happens in the last 90 minutes of day 3, under the specific pressure of flights booked for that evening. It's not a coincidence that the actual decision-making compresses into the moment right before the deadline hits. That's Parkinson's law, working exactly as described, live, in a conference room, with a whiteboard full of exercises nobody needed. 4 different situations. Hiring, budget, a bug fix, a strategy offsite. None of them are alike on the surface. All of them follow the identical shape. Real work takes a fraction of the allotted time, and the container fills anyway, because nothing forces it not to. But here's the part nobody expects, and it's the part that should actually change how you set deadlines. Tightening the deadline doesn't just save time. It doesn't come at the cost of quality, the way most managers instinctively assume it will. In case after case above, the compressed version wasn't worse. The hire from week 3 was as strong as the hire from week 12. The fix from day 1 was as solid as the fix from day 13. Once you strip out the unnecessary design meetings, the decision from 90 minutes was the same decision the room eventually landed on after 3 days of circling. The extra time wasn't invested in quality. It was invested in anxiety management, defensive polish, and activity that existed to justify the time given, not to improve the outcome. That's the uncomfortable implication. Most of the thoroughness that a long deadline produces isn't actually thoroughness. It's theatre performed for an audience of nobody, paid for in time that could have gone somewhere else entirely. Here's my own read on why this is so hard to act on, even once you know it. Cutting a deadline feels irresponsible in the moment, and the payoff that the work turns out fine only shows up after the fact, when nobody's watching closely enough to update their instincts. So managers keep defaulting to generous timelines, because generous feels safe. Even though the evidence, from Parkinson's civil service data to your own team's sprint history, says tight is usually just as safe and considerably cheaper. There's also an asymmetry in how the 2 failure modes get punished, and it's worth naming because it explains why this bias survives even in managers who intellectually agree with everything above. If you set a deadline too tight and the work genuinely suffers, that failure is visible, immediate, and traceable directly back to your decision. Everyone remembers the rushed launch. If you set a deadline too generous, and the extra weeks get burned on busy work nobody needed, that failure is invisible. Nobody can point to the specific hour that was wasted. There's no missed launch to blame it on. The cost is real, but it's diffuse. spread thin across dozens of small decisions that never individually look like a mistake. Managers optimize against the failure mode they can see, not the one that's actually more common, and generous deadlines almost never look like a mistake in the moment they're set. It's also worth being precise about what this fix does not mean, because tighten every deadline is a caricature of the actual lesson, not the lesson itself. Some work genuinely needs a long runway, deep research, a hard technical problem with a real unknown at its core, something that depends on external timing entirely outside your control. Parkinson's law isn't a claim that all tasks are secretly quick. It's a claim that the deadline you set, not the intrinsic difficulty of the task, determines how much time actually gets consumed for the enormous share of ordinary work that has no genuine external constraint on it at all. The skill isn't compressing everything. It's noticing which of your team's deadlines were set out of habit or comfort rather than out of any real requirement, and shrinking exactly those. So here's the actual fix. And it's a change in the question you ask when you assign work. Don't ask, what's a comfortable deadline for this? Ask, what's the tightest deadline that's still realistic? And give that one instead. Shrinking the container doesn't shrink the quality of the work that goes into it. It just removes the empty space the work was going to expand into anyway. The report still gets written, the bug still gets fixed, the hire still gets made. What disappears is the padding, the extra meetings, the extra polish nobody requested, the extra rounds of second guessing that a longer runway invites by default. Set the tighter deadline on purpose, on the next task you hand off, and watch what actually gets cut. It usually isn't quality. It's the parts you never needed in the first place. If that changed how you see your team, follow for more.